can't relate to people like that unless you grew up around it. You can accept them and you can learn to love them, but it's difficult when you're from such very different worlds. But then there's also probably not other people who it's worth falling in love with more than people who are different from ourselves. If a person's pretty different from you, you have a lot of work to do, getting to know them. If a person is just like you, there isn't a lot of work to do. It's not interesting. But you do want someone who's going to sharpen you and make you better. And that's the hard part, because that means having to open yourself up and be vulnerable to somebody else so they can see you for your flaws. You want someone who accepts you for your faults and doesn't just overlook them, and loves you for your totality, and doesn't just look at you and go, I love you, even though. And how are we intended to be? It's different how we turn out, I guess. And it's easy for us to say, by the way, sorry, let me fold my arm when I say this. It's how the world made me. Okay, tell me you're weak without telling me that you're weak. Is the world gonna do bad things to you? Yeah, it's part of living. But you know how some people turn out better and some people turn out worse? The world breaks everybody. But some people end up stronger in those broken parts, and some people remain weaker in those broken parts. Which of those you turn out to be is going to largely depend on you. If people end up jaded afterwards, and they're, again, arms folded and brooding, and like, I can't let anybody in because I've been hurt before. Yeah, okay, fine, but just understand that's not being strong. Strength is falling off the horse and getting back on. Strength is refusing to be changed by the world. If you have two puzzle pieces and they don't fit, there isn't necessarily a bad puzzle piece. Like you might think, like for example, I'll leave it at that. So they just don't fit. They just don't go together. Well, which one's right? Which one's wrong? Neither. They just don't fit. Think about your two favorite songs. Think about your two favorite songs. Now think about the melody of one song, and then try singing that melody over the rhythm or the beat or the music of your second song. Is it going to work? No, it's not that it's a bad melody. It's not that it's bad music. It's not that the chords are bad. Sometimes the melody just doesn't fit the chords, and they're both good. They just don't fit together. But so often theoretically we wouldn't get angry and just say, oh, I'm just gonna, if you wrote both of those things and you're like, it just doesn't fit. Hopefully you don't just throw them both out and say they're terrible. Hopefully you can recognize, well, this melody, this tune will be good for some other chords, and these chords will be good for some other melody. And then, just recognize that sometimes things just don't work. Not that either of those two things are good or bad. And this happens. And people are like this as well. It's kind of like going for a job interview. If you apply for a job and you get in for the interview, what they're telling you is you have all the qualifications that are necessary to get this job. They wouldn't interview you unless you qualified. Now the question is, do you fit in with this company? Do you fit in with our culture, our organization, our goals? And so if you think of it this way, what you hopefully can understand is, if you don't get the job, it's not a terrible thing. It's disappointing maybe because you wanted a job or you needed a job, but all that they're not telling you you're not good enough. What they're telling you is you don't fit as well as somebody else. And if you don't fit with that company, you hopefully wouldn't have wanted to be there anyway. And it's kind of like that with people. If you don't fit with the people or another person, it's better to find out than to not find out. Yeah, you had your hand. Yeah. So you can be in love with an avatar maybe, like an avatar of the person, like this image that you have of them. And so, like for example, you think of some celebrity. If you have like a celebrity crush, and if you think about what the crush is based on, anybody have a celebrity crush? Yeah. I have one, and people think, and it's not for the reason that people will think. It's for a completely different reason. She's an actress, and I'm not really familiar with many of her movies, but she's a singer, and she did a cover of Tom Waits covers. Anybody ever hear of Tom Waits before? Exactly. He's just like some dude who had, like, you wouldn't know his stuff, but he's really good. He's just not really well known. And I just thought, she's a really famous actress, and she did a whole album of covers of this guy's music. And I was like, that was interesting to me. Like, who the hell has ever heard of Tom Waits? By the way, Tom Waits grew up in National City. He used to work at Napoleon's Pizza, turns out. I didn't know that until I was already a fan. But he's got this really weird voice, and his whatever. But anyway, she did a whole cover of his stuff, and I just thought, that's interesting. And I listened to it, and I'm all, and it's good. It has nothing to do with her acting. It doesn't even have much to do with how she looks. I just thought, who the hell would do that kind of a thing? Now, if I met this person, I imagine that they're nothing at all like what you would imagine them to be. But if you think enough about a person, you start to build up all kinds of attributes around them. Oh, I bet they're this, I bet that they're that. And you fall in love with not the person themselves, because let's face it, you can't fall in love with the person themselves. As we're saying, we don't know them. But you're falling in love with something that you've created, if that makes sense. And a lot of times love is like that. You don't fall in love with the person who they actually are. You fall in love with the person who you imagine them to be. And to fall in love is to create a religion with a false god, in a certain sense. You don't know anything about them, but you build them up to be something magnificent and splendid. And then, it's like you imagine them to be almost like a child imagines their parents to be the biggest and the strongest and the this and the that. And then someday, when your parent falters in some way, or as you get older and you find out your parents were wrong about something, it completely destroys your image of them. And that's part of growing up, because very few of us will ever forgive our parents for not being the strongest, or for not being 100% right about everything. And then we fold our arms, or we scratch our chin, we jam our hands in our pockets, and we think, I bet they're wrong about a lot of things. And then, of course, we presume that we're right about everything. And then there's an equilibrium that reforms maybe as we get older, where we realize they're not perfect, they're human. And it wasn't so much that they ever claimed to be perfect, it was that we imagined them to be. And so we were let down by them because of it was our own fault for being let down, because we expected them to be something they never claimed to be, and that they never could be. And sometimes love is like that. You meet someone and you're like, wow, they're so fill in the blank. And we forget the fact that it's not a God, that they're humans, that they're just a man, that they're just a woman. And then we almost don't forgive them for that when they make a mistake or they screw up. Like, think about your celebrity crush, if you have one. And then imagine, you meet them and you hang out with them, and I don't know, and you go to their house, and then you find out that they leave the door open when they take a shit. And all of a sudden you're like, I thought you didn't do that. I thought you just were walked around the earth perfectly. No, what? Because they can write a song? Because they can act, or they can not even recite their own lines. They can recite somebody else's lines convincingly with a bunch of editors and a director. And they never maybe claim to be perfect. It's just us. And so you can start to imagine now, if you're famous and you're thinking, oh, if I'm famous, people will love me. They won't love you. They're going to love the avatar of you. And imagine it's probably very difficult to find anybody, to find real love when you're famous, because they never really love you for who you are, because they can't know who you are. And so that's probably one of the reasons that you find a lot of famous people who date other famous people, because they can relate to one another. It's kind of like, very wealthy people oftentimes will date other very wealthy people. It's not just because they want to hoard their money, but you can't relate to people like that unless you grew up around it. You can accept them and you can learn to love them, but it's difficult when you're from such very different worlds. But then there's also probably not other people who it's worth falling in love with more than people who are different from ourselves, because that's the thing that allows us to live, as we've said, more than one lifetime. We get to see very different perspectives. If a person's pretty different from you, then you have a lot of work to do getting to know them. If a person is just like you, there isn't a lot of work to do. It's not interesting. You want somebody who's alike to you in key ways, probably, like your values maybe, but someone who's different enough from you where you can consistently challenge each other. Now, you want somebody who's going to challenge you. You don't want somebody who's going to be passive. You don't want somebody who's going to be contrarian, and every time you every time you suggest something, they want to argue with you about it, or I don't know if any of you know someone who's like this, but like they'll ask you, I don't know, like you'll go eat, and they'll ask you, I don't know, do I want pasta or steak? And you'll say, you probably want steak, and they go, no, that's too filling, I want pasta. In other words, every time you suggest something, they always go with the complete opposite of it. You know, I knew someone like this. And then that's a person that after a while you just stop giving suggestions to. Or if you get full of contempt, you choose the better option because you want them to choose the worse one. Just because you're annoyed that they're always being contrarian. You don't want that person either, because then every day is a fight. But you do want someone who's going to sharpen you and make you better. And that's the hard part, because that means having to open yourself up and be vulnerable to somebody else so they can see you for your flaws. And kind of going back so much what Asif was saying, you want someone who accepts you for your faults and doesn't just overlook them, and loves you for your totality, and doesn't just look at you and go, I love you, even though. I see people who post things like on social media all the time about like their friends or their best friends or their parents or their significant others, like a birthday, kind of like a celebration. And they oftentimes begin their comments with like, even though we drive each other crazy. And that's how they start off. And I'm like, my God, that's how you start off? Like that's the defining part of your relationship. Even though how about maybe towards the end, if it even has to come up at all? But it's a Rorschach test. Whatever, if I were to ask you about your best friend and say, introduce your best friend to me in 2 sentences, it's hard to do. Because you're going to have to pick out the most interesting characteristics or the things that stand out to you the most. And if that's the thing that stands out to you the most, that you drive each other crazy, then that says something about your view of friendships or love, that the idea is that it's always this kind of combative thing. You probably don't want it to be combative, but if you're wrong, you want someone hopefully to tell you that you're wrong. Not in front of the world, like if any of you get, if you have a best friend, hopefully a best friend will stab you in the front, not in the back. But hopefully they're going to do it when people aren't around. They're with you and someone tells you you're wrong and they got your back. No, they're not. They're right. Screw you up. Then afterwards, hey man, you were wrong. Years ago, when I was living in Los Angeles, a friend of mine, I was in a band. My bass player and I went to a show with another friend of mine, and we got into a fight with a bunch of people. Long story. And so as we're leaving, my friend, he was a bigger dude, and he's just going off as we're leaving. He says, we're safe. He's like, okay. He says, dude, what the hell? I go, what do you mean? He's like, you were wrong. What do you mean I was wrong? How could I? And then he tells me he thought I was wrong for picking the fight. But he didn't stop in the middle of the fight and go, hold on now, you deserve this ass kicking because you were wrong. He has your back on it, but then again, he also didn't want to let me go with that, with thinking that everything was okay. It didn't mean that the friendship was in danger. If you have a whole bunch of those things in a row, then maybe. And you probably want a companion like that, someone who's willing to tell you because they love you enough to tell you that you were wrong, because they don't want you to fall into, because you don't want the love to be something that enables you in bad behavior. And by bad behavior, what I mean is behavior that actually makes you a worse person. That's why this first point was interesting to me, to love a person as they're brought into the world. Because as you're brought into the world changes most people. And so you can see a person who's like angry and bitter and resentful, but maybe you can see them as they originally came in, because you see how they became that way. And maybe there's a thing there where you're bitter and you're resentful and you're full of contempt and you're angry, but that's because of the way that you've been treated. And so maybe if you have like adopting a pit bull, maybe if we can give you love and affection, all the things that you're lacking, maybe you'll feel safe to be the person who you were when you were brought into the world, not the person that the world has turned you into. But of course, you have to be careful, because what's a pit bull still in there, still in them, can still bite you. Even if you say, well, yeah, but it's just how they've been raised. Fine, even if, but it is how they've been raised. So that means there is still that danger that the person's going to continue being the thing that they've been made into, rather than the thing that they were brought into. If this makes sense. And the thing here about how we're meant to be requires knowing them and accepting them. This is probably true. because that's a big part of it, because you can't be vulnerable towards somebody who doesn't accept you. Are there things in your life that don't deserve to be accepted? Yeah. I wonder if any of you have ever, or I wonder if this will ever happen. If you'll date somebody and you'll be like, they're wonderful, they're spectacular, blah, blah, and then you'll find out that like they cheated on somebody before. And if that would change your view of them. Or if you would say, oh no, they're different now. Maybe, but I wonder if you were talking to them and you asked them, so what happened in your last relationship? Oh man, she was crazy. By the way, we're talking about red flags. There's one. If they tell you that their last boyfriend, girlfriend was crazy, there's a red flag. That's a red flag. And I don't mean for the ex, I mean for the person. If that's the first thing that they come out with, let me slander that person, let me destroy that person's reputation. Or maybe they're saying it because they don't want to tell you what they really think. I miss them tremendously. Maybe they're just trying to slander them so that you don't get jealous. Either way, it's probably not a good thing. Was the person crazy? Probably, maybe. Are any of us not at least a little bit crazy? But if the first thing out of their mouth is to try to destroy the other person's reputation, well, what do you think is going to happen to you if things don't go their way? They're giving us hints. People don't conceal who they are. Yeah, people don't conceal who they are. We conceal who people are. We make excuses for them so often. And you just got to figure out if it's a person, if you really love them, you don't have to make excuses for them. It's like your first car. Anybody have their first car yet? No? When you get your first car, it's probably going to be a piece of shit. But it's going to be your piece of shit. And you may not feel the need to make excuses for it. And by the way, nobody else better ever talk about your piece of shit. That's your piece of shit. Your car's a piece of shit. Shut up. I love my car, just exactly as it is. Dude, the bumper's falling off. So it's got some flaws. Who doesn't? But you acknowledge that the bumper's falling off. You don't pretend like the bumper's not falling off. The bumper's in perfect condition. Your bumper's falling off. You know? So to love someone means to see them as they're intended to be. And how are we intended to be? It's different. Going back to this first comment, it goes back to we're different from how we turn out, I guess. And it's easy for us to say, by the way, sorry, let me fold my arm when I say this. It's how the world made me. Okay, tell me you're weak without telling me that you're weak. Is the world gonna do bad things to you? Yeah, it's part of living. But you know how some people turn out better and some people turn out worse? The world breaks everybody. But some people end up stronger in those broken parts, and some people remain weaker in those broken parts. Which of those you turn out to be is going to largely depend on you. If people end up jaded afterwards, and again, arms folded and brooding, and like, I can't let anybody in because I've been hurt before. Yeah. Okay, fine, but just understand that's not being strong. Strength is falling off the horse and getting back on. Strength is refusing to be changed by the world. If you're a sweet person, you're a kind person, the world's going to do a number on you, man. Those of you who have kind personalities, the world's going to hurt you. It's going to break you. I could tell you, don't worry, just be kind. Everything's going to work out. Of course it's not going to. But that's what the foundation of the world is. Kind people who take care of each other. Of course there are terrible people out there. But are you going to let the terrible people turn you into one of them? Because I promise you, you're not going to turn terrible people into one of you. You're not going to turn terrible people into kind, sweet people. But you have to figure out, man, is it worth fighting for? Is your personality worth fighting for? Is the world worth fighting for to be better, to have more of you? And you can tell me which is more infectious, to be kind and hopefully that spreads, or to be mean and evil and hope that spreads. But it's only a hope. It's up to you to decide what you want to be and how you want to operate in the world. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? Happy Wednesday. Easy, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Done and done.